Hello, and welcome to our Substance Use Prevention Fundamental Series. I'm Laura Papard. I'm the Deputy Director for Treatment and Prevention at the Washington-Baltimore High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, and I'm also the Director of ADAPT, which stands for a Division for Advancing Prevention and Treatment. ADAPT is a new division in the Center for Drug Policy and Prevention at the University of Washington. And on behalf of ADAPT and the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives, I'd like to welcome you to this technical webinar today. We have been hosting a technical webinar series over the last few months, and we are fortunate to offer a complimentary webinar to a webinar we offered 2 weeks ago on risk factors. And I wanted to set the stage a little bit for all of you just to help you understand why we're offering this particular webinar. Over the last year, we've been providing individual technical assistance to HIDTA communities across the nation with their substance use prevention programming that they're implementing in those communities. And time again, risk factors and protective factors obviously are two of the things that are embedded within many of the programs being funded. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Diana Fishbein, who's the president and co-director of the National Prevention Science to Improve Lives, and a direct partner with us in delivering this series. 2 weeks ago, she delivered a wonderful presentation on risk factors for substance use. And today we're offering what we're calling a sister webinar to that, one on protective factors, and are very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Tony Biglan to help deliver that today. I wanted to thank Dr. Diana Fishbein for her support in helping us to secure subject matter experts for this. I want to thank Dr. Biglan, and I want to thank Dr. Patty Fersazidis, who is our Assistant Director for ADAPT, for helping to coordinate all of these webinars and really bring them to life. So with that, I will hand it over to Patty so she can go through some housekeeping with you. Enjoy.
Good day, everyone. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. Really quickly here. So I have changed the slide so you're able to see a housekeeping slide. This shows you the audience interface for today's webcast. We want to point your attention to two areas on the screen. One is the Ask a Question pane, which is located directly below the speaker image. This is where you can send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will be collecting these and addressing them throughout our Q&A sessions today. And then right below the Ask a Question pane, you'll find an Event Resources pane. And this is where, if you hit the little drop-down arrow, you can access a resource supplement that has been created for this event. That includes some resources that are recommended both by Dr. Biglan as well as the ADAPT team on this very topic. And if you have to miss a portion of today's webinar, a link to today's webinar recording is going to be made available on the ADAPT YouTube channel. That will come out to folks within about 24 to 48 hours after today's event via an email announcement. Once the webinar ends, you will receive a post-presentation survey, and we'd appreciate if you would take time to complete that and provide your feedback. Upon the completion of that survey, you'll automatically receive an email with a link to download a certificate of completion for today's event. We're excited to share that our certificates are now approved for continuing education units through NADAC. And so hopefully that will be an added value to some of you who are participating in today's webinar. And lastly, if you have any technical problems during today's webinar, we have contact information right there on the slides for GoToWebcast technical support, as well as emailing us at ADAPT in order to help you resolve any of those issues. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Tony Biglan. Dr. Biglan is a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute, as well as the president of Values to Action. He has conducted numerous experimental evaluations of family and school interventions to prevent tobacco, alcohol, and other drug use, as well as antisocial behavior and academic failure. Dr. Biglan is a former president of the Society for Prevention Research. His book, The Nurture Effect: How the Science of Human Behavior Can Improve Our Lives and Our World, describes how behavioral science research has brought us to the point where it's possible to evolve a society in which virtually every person is living a productive life in caring relationships with others. He, in fact, created Values to Action to help communities implement tested and effective preventive interventions and programs and policies. So welcome, Dr. Biglan.
Thank you. Am I on?
You are on.
Okay. So hopefully you can see the slide that says objectives. I'm hopeful that this presentation will help people to understand how prevention research seeks to identify conditions that reduce risk for substance use disorders and all other psychological and behavioral problems, because the problems are all interrelated. I hope that you'll become familiar with the social determinants of health and how they influence multiple outcomes for children, families, and communities, and that you'll understand the fundamental conditions that ensure successful development. And second to last, you'll know how preventive interventions work to combat risk through environments that nurture pro-social development. And finally, that you'll be able to recognize the need for comprehensive evidence-based programs and policies to create environments that nurture positive social development in all of its forms. So first I'm going to talk I'm going to talk primarily about protective factors, but I think it's important to start with a brief review of the risk factors, because in fact, most of the protective factors are things that are factors that are countering the risk factors. And for more information on this, you'll have a very good program that Diana Fishbein did a couple weeks ago, which is available. So, risk factors. I would argue that over the past 50 years, prevention scientists have identified numerous risk factors that make it more likely that children and adolescents will develop significant psychological and behavioral problems. Those problems include depression, anxiety, aggression, substance use, academic failure, obesity, metabolic syndrome, and suicide. And I think it's important to keep in mind that these problems are frequently interrelated. Having one of them makes it more likely that a young person will have other of these problems. And the reason I think that's so important is that there has been a tendency for us to focus on this narrow set of problems and do that not in the context of the fact that there are all these other problems. So for example, if you want to prevent substance use, it would help to reduce the likelihood of depression and anxiety because these problems are interrelated. And so increasingly we need preventive interventions that are focused on the conditions that lead to all of these problems, rather than just narrowly focused on substance use or narrowly focused on antisocial behavior. So I'll keep coming back to that. So there are types of risk factors. There are behavioral patterns that are risk factors, such as aggressive behavior, which is a risk factor for substance use. It's a risk factor for academic failure. It's a risk factor for depression. These behavioral patterns are things that we need to prevent. So very often, if you're interested in preventing substance use, you need to be interested in preventing aggressive social behavior, depression, anxiety, academic failure, and so on. Then there are biological risk factors: genetic, metabolic syndrome, chronic physiological stress processes. I'm going to talk a little bit about those. And then there are toxic social environments that involve coercion, threat, and neglect. And finally, there's poverty, inequality, discrimination, and harmful marketing. All of these are risk factors for the development of substance use and related problems. So I want to talk a little bit about toxic social conditions. Essentially, human beings have developed two ways of being in the world. And what I'll call the first one the fast developmental pathway, and I think you'll see why I call it fast in a moment. This is a graph that essentially describes this fast developmental pathway. And in the context of poverty and in the context of discrimination, families in particular, but also schools, are more likely to have coercive social environments. And I'm going to And what I mean by coercive social environments is that the people use aversive behavior to control each other. They yell at each other. They argue with each other. It works immediately to get other people to stop doing something they don't like. but in fact, it doesn't help people develop the social graces that they need to be successful in life. And so what happens is that in the context of coercive environments, kids fail to develop good self-regulation. And that makes it more likely that they'll be aggressive and uncooperative. And when a young child gets to school and they have a repertoire of aggressive and uncooperative behavior, they're more likely to fail academically, and they're more likely to be rejected by peers. What that results in is deviant peer group formation. Tom DeShawn, a psychologist who died at really too early an age, did some excellent research on this. And what he found was that when kids get into early adolescence and they have this history of aggressive and uncooperative behavior and social rejection, they meet other kids who are also rejected, and it's magic. They suddenly found a friend. Tom studied the interactions of kids, early adolescents, who were at risk. He had them bring a friend into the lab, and they videotaped and coded their interactions. And what he discovered was that when kids engaged in talk of deviant behavior and the other person laughed, deviant talk, laughter, it predicted arrest rates 2 years later. He was watching the development of antisocial behavior. And in fact, he and a colleague of his later studied these kids when they were late adolescents. And he discovered that if they were having conversations with demeaning talk about women, demeaning talk, laughter, that predicted violence toward women 2 years later. So we've actually learned how to watch the socialization, but it all starts with kids who are socially rejected and living in threat. And I want to emphasize the threat, because what you see here is that the deviant peer groups are the training ground for the development of drug use, depression, antisocial behavior, and also early child rearing. Now think about this from an evolutionary perspective. Humans have evolved the tendency that when they live in threatening conditions, such as what I'm describing here, they're more likely to have their babies early. Because in a dangerous world, if you don't have your babies early, you may not have them at all. And so humans have evolved a response to stressful environments that produce this trajectory. And the other thing I have here is that coercive environments lead to increased likelihood of cardiovascular disease. And the reason that's important, prevention fans, is that if you want to promote prevention, you have got to get the healthcare system to understand that if they want to reduce cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, and so on, one of the things they need to do is change these environments, because these environments drive this development. And in fact, I'm going to talk about this. This is a diagram from the work of Greg Miller, who has been studying the physiological process as the result. Now, you see, dad he's not being abusive. He probably wouldn't get, the state wouldn't take this child away for the way he's acting, but it's aversive to that child. And even these kind of more mild social interactions increase the likelihood of epigenetic changes and post-translational modifications and tissue remodeling that change the physiology of the child in ways that eventually lead to heart disease, tumor growth, and frailty syndrome. It's now well established that these stressful social environments produce these kinds of results. And so there's a wonderful book by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it helps us to understand this physiological process and the way that it affects people's development. What Sapolsky documents in a book that's about this thick is all of the ways in which humans experience stress. And the way it works is called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortex. And what happens is that in the context of a stressor, let's say the zebra sees a lion, it causes a cascade of hormones that result in the release of cortisol, which helps to increase the heart rate and the blood pressure, and it enables the zebra to either take flight or fight. And if you're a zebra and it's a lion, probably better to take flight. And if the zebra is lucky enough to have an older, slower zebra nearby, zebra gets away. And what happens? Well, the stressor's gone, the hormones get reabsorbed, and it's over. And the physiological response isn't chronic. It's just in response to that circumstance. Now, if this were a live talk and I could see you, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you've ever had this experience. Have you ever had the experience of lying in bed, stressing about somebody who wasn't lying next to you? In the 100 talks I've given in the last few years, most hands go up. It is the human condition. We can be in the presence of stressful stimuli simply by thinking about them. We can worry about what happened yesterday. We can worry about what happened tomorrow. Who is this person who's being mean to me, whatever. And so this is, as I've studied this, I sort of go, well, what everybody needs essentially is a hug, if a hug will work for them. But of course, the image of hugging an HPA axis isn't too appealing. So here's a picture of my son, Michael, and his son, Grayson, who's now 10 years old. But when I saw this picture, I said, for me, this is an image of what we need. We need to care for each other. We need to make sure that people feel safe and protected and warm. But it's not just human beings. Every organism needs to have this kind of safety. So here's Charlie, who may be climbing on my lap in the middle of this talk. He's well fed. He's lying in the sun. He's just fine. He's happy. That's what every organism needs. The problems we confront as humans may not be as complicated as we think. Everybody needs to be cared for, respected, listened to, and so on. So let me now talk about protective factors. All of the things that nurture successful child and adolescent development is what I'm going to talk about. And I want to talk about it in terms of what I call the nurture consilience. I want to argue that, there's been like 40 years of research on human well-being. We've learned an enormous amount. And I want to argue that diverse disciplines that include evolutionary biology, medicine, public health, social work, social, clinical, and developmental psychology all converge in identifying the environmental conditions that promote versus undermine well-being. We know what people need to thrive. I found it useful to organize the evidence around the concept of nurturance, though, if you find a better term for that, that's okay. But I think we really need to get everybody to be constantly reminded that this is what we need throughout society, at every level of society. We need to focus on nurturance. We need to turn away from competition, to turn away from self-aggrandizement and care for each other. It turns out it's a biologically vital thing. So what are nurturing environments? Well, first of all, they minimize toxic biological and social conditions, the coercive interactions that I was talking about before, but also biological toxicities like high airborne lead or high amounts of omega-6 in the diet. Second, nurturing environments limit opportunities and influences for problem behavior. Opportunities like kids home alone, unsupervised after school. That is a time of high probability that kids will experiment with problem behavior, especially if they have friends in the house, and especially if the liquor cabinet is open. So limiting opportunity is important, but also it's important to reduce influences for problem behavior. Influences like the marketing of vape, the marketing of tobacco, the marketing of unhealthful food, the marketing of alcohol, all of which have been shown to significantly contribute to the involvement of kids with the use of substances. And I'll go on. So the third thing is that nurturing environments need to richly reinforce diverse forms of pro-social behavior. And I'm not talking about M&Ms and stickers. I'm talking about listening and caring and respecting and hugging and joining and cooperating with each other. These are vital conditions that help children to develop the resilience they need, to develop the skills they need. And we all thrive on reinforcement. And the fourth thing is that nurturing environments promote psychological flexibility. And what I mean by psychological flexibility is the mindful and pragmatic pursuit of one's values, even in the context of troubling thoughts and feelings. And if you remember lying in bed, stressing about somebody, one of the things we've learned about psychological flexibility is that you can get better at stepping back from your thoughts, even when you're lying there and you notice that you're having the thoughts, and noticing that you're having the thoughts actually enables you to step back from them and they become less powerful. Oh, I'm having the thought that this person is not treating me well. I can have that thought. What will work for me in that situation? I think I'll actually just try and be patient with that person and try to get to know them better. Okay, now you're pursuing your values of having good relationships with other people, and you can do that in the context of the thoughts and feelings you have, but you don't have to believe those thoughts and feelings. And so, and there's a whole, well, if you read my book, The Nurture Effect, you'll learn a lot more about psychological flexibility, but it's revolutionized clinical psychology. Okay, so then there's the slow developmental pathway. Not rushing to have your babies early because you don't need to. And this is the pathway where, in the context of a nurturing environments, you develop good self-regulation, you develop good language and social skills, and you're more likely to be academically successful, you're more likely to be pro-social, you're more likely to build friendships that can last a lifetime. And what do you get? You get compassionate, multiply skilled, resilient, and values-oriented adults. And so that's I think what we're looking for. And this is the summary of all the protective factors. This is what we need. And we need it in every environment, in families and schools and neighborhoods. So let me talk about the power of prevention. I was on the National Academy of Medicine committee that reviewed the evidence on prevention. We published our report, which you see here, in 2009. And the committee, which went into it going, well, these committees are usually chaired by somebody who is not a prevention, in this case, prevention scientist. And so there was some skepticism, but after reviewing the evidence, the committee concluded that we really have the scientific foundation to ensure, if we make use of what we know, that virtually every young person arrives at adulthood with the skills, interests, values, and health habits they need to lead a productive life in caring relationships with other people. And that's sort of the mantra that has driven me since this report came out. There's a subsequent report that was published in 2019. I was also on that committee. And in that one, we felt like, gee, we haven't been as successful as we might in getting all of these things adopted. But here we are, having, I'm told, maybe 150 people studying prevention. This is growing. ADAPT is doing just a wonderful job in getting the word out. And you are the people who can make this a reality. So I shall go on. So when Diana Fishbein and I were part of the Promise Neighborhood Research Consortium, we developed this summary where we tried to summarize what it takes to, how people develop successfully. So there are distal influences that are distal, meaning further away from the ultimate outcome, and proximal influences, things that are more proximate to the development. And then the biological, all these affect biological processes and result in positive or negative outcomes. And so I'm going to walk this through in terms of the distal influences, the proximal influences. I'm not going to talk much about the biological mediators because I think Denny Fishbein is on this call and she would laugh at my lack of understanding of biological mediators, but she is an expert on it. And I'm going to talk about the primary outcomes. But actually, let me talk about the primary outcomes first. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to make sure that people are academically successful, that they're verbally fluent, that they have math and skills, reading skills, good grades, and they're proficient in these things. And so those are the things we need that are protective, massively protective. Kids who have a good education are much less likely to develop quite a variety of problems. And then there's social and emotional competence. Kids who have good self-regulation, they can regulate their emotions, they can have emotions and not act on them in ways that cause problems for them and others. They have pro-social attitudes. They want to help other people. They're skilled. They have social emotional competence. And then there are psychological and behavioral problems. They have a minimum of psychological and behavioral problems like anxiety and depression and so on. And they're physically healthy. They are not obese. They are not developing metabolic syndrome, which is a syndrome of obesity that's associated with diabetes, which is associated with cardiovascular disease. So that's what we're striving for. So I'm going to talk about distal influences, income and resources that are important, social cohesion, and physical environment. So let me talk about that now. So with respect to income and resources, we want families to have economic well-being. Family poverty is clearly a risk factor. There was a study done in North Carolina that showed that when kids who were in Native American families and the tribe opened a casino, and it suddenly increased the wealth of those families. And as a result of that, nothing else happened. There was no treatment or anything, but with those families, the incidence of psychological and behavioral problems dropped precipitously simply because the families suddenly had more money. So that's a really important issue for people. And when we need well-funded schools, it's amply documented that in schools in disadvantaged communities have fewer resources. They have fewer extracurricular activities, and they have typically less well-paid teachers, less skilled teachers. And so we need well-funded schools. And third, we need access to health care. So these are some of the distal influences that are important for kids' development. Then there's social cohesion. We need communities and families and schools that have pro-social norms and good informal social control. For example, there's clear evidence that in neighborhoods where if a kid were doing something problematic, that somebody besides their parents would do something about it, that the parents are sufficiently connected with each other that they help each other monitor their children's behavior and other kids' behavior and so on. And that informal social control is huge in terms of preventing problems and nurturing success. Connectedness, social capital. In communities where people know each other, there are advantages. In communities where people know people who have skills that they may not have, connections they may not have, they do better. So for example, if you have a neighborhood that has, and this was true 50 years ago, that there wasn't the kind of division where some people are living in gated communities and other people are living in high poverty. When I was growing up many years ago, in the 1950s, there was a policeman. There was this is on my street where I was growing up. There was a policeman, there was a lawyer, there was a plumber, there was a mover, all these different people. Well, if you live next to a lawyer, you get a problem. That lawyer could maybe just informally help you out. But if that lawyer lives in a gated community and you don't know any lawyers, you got a problem. Healthy community norms is another one. You want communities that that have pro-social norms and are promoting them. And the last thing is you want a minimum of conflict. Conflict that's associated with fighting in families, fighting in schools, but also the conflict that's involved in, for example, the way in which police forces in many disadvantaged communities are treating minority group members. It's a huge stressor. It shortens people's lives. So then there's the physical environment. We need affordable housing for everyone. We do not need to have people living in cars or sleeping on the streets. We need parks with walkable neighborhoods. Clear evidence that that's beneficial to the physical and social development of people. We need trees and flowers and attractive buildings. These actually affect people's well-being. We need to limit access to alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs and firearms. It's very clear that in neighborhoods that produce increased levels of problems, that there's increased availability and marketing of alcohol and tobacco and other drugs and firearms. And then there's access to nutritious food. We need supermarkets and community gardens in every neighborhood so that people are eating nutritious food. We need also to eliminate toxic waste. More disadvantaged communities are significantly more likely to live in areas where there's toxic waste. Then there are proximal influences, families, schools, and peers. And now we're getting to areas that you probably had greater exposure to because there's been more work on it. So what do we need? We need nurturing families. Two-parent families are less stressed. Their income is typically better. There are advantages to having two-parent families. We need families that are involved in learning-related activities that are, and with the pandemic, it's been a real challenge. Parents trying to make sure that their kids show up at the Zoom meeting and follow through and do their homework and so on. But even when the pandemic is over, we need to be encouraging families in learning activities. We need to have parents talking to their kids. There's evidence that in more challenged families where there's less economic well-being and less time for parenting, single parent families and people working two jobs and so on, that parents may not talk as frequently. The number of words they say to their kids is less. That has an impact in terms of kids' verbal development that carries forward. And there are efforts to try and improve those kinds of conversation, the talking to kids. There needs to be involved monitoring where parents are tracking what their kids are doing and talking to their kids about what they're doing and making sure that their kids are not being exposed to risky activities. We need non-harsh limit setting. Non-harsh being not coercive, not you can't do that, or you stop that. That's not going to work as well as setting limits in advance and reinforcing kids when they adhere to those limits. Richly reinforcing, I've already talked about that. And we need positive role models, and we need health maintenance and hygiene, and we need people involved in positive activities. I talked earlier about the lack of after-school activities, extracurricular activities in poorly resourced schools. There are differences of 40 versus none in terms of the number of extracurricular activities that are available to kids depending on the school that they go to. We need every school to have extracurricular activities because they have a benefit that's substantial. Okay, so let's see. There was a wonderful paper by Leslie et al., which I didn't put on the list, but if you remind me, I'll make that available. It describes 16 evidence-based family interventions. And the paper was written to try and influence the healthcare providers to make sure that these programs become available to more people. And so this is just a list of them. And what you'll see if you go through the impact of these, that all of them have an impact on substance use. And they also have an impact on the other problems too, because as I said, they're all intertwined. You change the family environment, you prevent a variety of outcomes. And so I'm just, I say this to say, look, there are at least 16 evidence-based family interventions. And if you're working in prevention, one of the things you should be doing is trying to make sure that these programs become more widely available. My organization, Values to Action, is trying to work with communities and help set up action circles to help get the healthcare system to be sure that it's providing these kinds of positive programs. And I'm just going to tell you about one of them, the Nurse-Family Partnership. This is a program that was developed in the University of Rochester, which is my alma mater. And a guy named David Olds thought that if a nurse could befriend high-risk moms who were, pregnant for the first time, that he could reduce the likelihood of subsequent problems for these kids. And he's done 3 randomized trials over a period of like 25 years, and it's shown, there are 200,000 families that have benefited from this. And this is one of the moms from one of those programs. And the program is designed to be available to high-risk moms during pregnancy and through the first 2 years of the child's life. So imagine that, here's a 16-year-old girl and she's just discovered that she's pregnant. Her family is furious with her. Her boyfriend says it isn't his. She doesn't want to marry him anyway. And you can imagine that the anxiety and distress that a child, a 16-year-old, would feel in those circumstances. So along comes a nurse, and she contacts the girl, and she sits down with the girl, and the first thing she does is she just tries to help her find some social support for this. And so, for example, she might say, well, is there anybody in your family that you could talk to that could be supportive? Well, I've got this aunt, and she's never judges me. I think I could. Okay, why don't you talk to her in the next week, and I'll be back next week, and let's just see. So she's helping the girl to set up what she needs to make her way through this, and maybe over time helping the parents to calm down and become more supportive and so on. The second thing she does is she starts talking to her about, well, what do you want to do in life? What kind of a career would you like to have? So right there, she's trying to prevent her from dropping out of school, and in fact, trying to help her to get on a pathway to her success in having an income, which is vital. She also works on contraception, so she doesn't have another baby right after the first one, which is a common problem. So she makes sure that the mom gets prenatal care. She helps her stop smoking if she's smoking, because that's a risk factor for problems. The baby's born, and if you've ever had a first baby, it's like, oh, the baby's crying. What do I do? Well, here's a nurse who says, oh yeah, that's normal, and here's the things you can do, and so on and so forth, and helps her through that. And so, and I've already talked about work life. Well, so this has been evaluated in 3 randomized trials, and it has been shown to have significant effects in reducing abuse and neglect of the mother, and improving children's behavioral development and mother's economic well-being and time to the next baby. And in addition, children's arrests. They followed some of these kids into adolescence and found that the ones that got the nurse family partnership had half the rates of arrests at 15 years old than the kids who didn't get this. This is a powerful program, and it's just one of many that could be available in your community and would significantly reduce the problems that we're all trying to prevent. So then there's richly reinforcing diverse forms of pro-social behavior. I've already talked about that. We're not talking about M&Ms and stickers. We're talking about attention, listening, smiling, touching, hugging, approval, and warmth. So as I said, we thrive on reinforcement. So then there are school influences. We need high quality early education. This is a proven benefit in terms of the long-term success of kids, and it needs to be made available. There is a woman in Texas whose name escapes me at the moment, who has developed good ways of supporting early childhood providers so that they become more skilled in nurturing the development of young children. And if you send me an email at tony@ori.org, that's tony@ori.org, I will come up with her name, and if you're trying to improve the quality of childcare, I can connect you with her. And so we need quality education. We need effective, explicit instruction, especially in reading and math. A child who doesn't learn to read by 3rd grade will be unlikely to ever learn to read. And that is a sentence to a life of poverty and struggle. And it does require explicit instruction. Now, this is one that I get kind of upset about, because we have known that phonics instruction that explicitly teaches children how to decode is essential for kids to learn to read. Now, there are a lot of kids who kind of pick this up on their own, but a kid who has not had a lot of good verbal stimulation and experience and reading to the child early on will not have those skills, and we can teach those kids. And in fact, Values to Action is creating action circles to try and help communities adopt effective ways of making sure that kids learn to read. If you want to reduce disparities in learning, one of the major things you need to do is focus on reading. Then there's positive school climate. The positive behavior intervention and support system is in 26,000 schools in the country, and it sets up a school-wide approach to supporting positive behavior. And so it's, again, another resource. You need to have good school attendance. You need to have health education and prevention. And you also need after-school educational activities. And I've already mentioned the huge difference between affluent schools and poorer schools. Okay, I want to talk about one school-based program, which I should tell you that I have a small financial relationship with the company that's developed this version of the Good Behavior Game, the PAX Good Behavior Game. But long before there was the PAX version of the Good Behavior Game, a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins decided that this program that was developed by behaviorists in the 1960s could be useful for making sure that children learn to cooperate and good self-regulation. And the way it works is you got a team of maybe 4 kids. And if those kids work for a period of time, you might just start with 5 minutes, you can work it up to an hour, that they work cooperatively without disruptive behavior, that they get a reward. And the rewards originally were things like 5 minutes of extra of recess. And it turns out that has a magical effect on having kids cooperating. If you always laughed at that kid who was, cutting up and so on, well, now you're in a group where you're not going to get the reward if you laugh at that kid or you encourage that kid. And so the behavior changes. You've enlisted the other kids in supporting the positive behavior. So Shep Kellum, psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, did a randomized trial of this program. And he followed these kids. They got the Good Behavior Game just in 1st and 2nd grade, and he followed them into early adulthood. And here's what he found. He found that there was more time for teaching and learning in the first month of implementing this program, and there was less stress for staff and students. In the first year, there was better attendance, fewer referrals, fewer service needs, less illness, happier families, less vandalism, better economics. In 2 to 3 years later, there was ADHD was prevented, oppositional defiant disorder was prevented, and there was less need for special education. He followed these kids into middle school and found that they were less likely to smoke and use alcohol. They had fewer conduct disorders, and they were less likely to be arrested. And he followed them into adulthood and found that they were less likely to have problems with suicidality and depression. They were less likely to be engaged in violent crime. They were more likely to graduate from high school, and they were more likely to attend college. Not bad for a program that was done just in 1st and 2nd grade. And the Washington Institute for Public Policy, which is a national treasure because it carefully evaluates the cost and benefit of all of these preventive programs. If you've got a preventive program that you're considering looking at, go to the Washington State Institute for Public Policy and look up the program, and you can find out what the return on investment is. And the analysis that they've done on the Good Behavior Game is that the benefit to cost ratio is $62.80 for every dollar expended. Now, if you could invest $1 and get $62 return, you'd be very well off. And so this program has benefits for the participants. They make more money. It's also has benefits in terms of reducing criminal justice costs, healthcare costs, and so on. It's a particularly good program. And so, let's see. Peer influences. Positive influences are having pro-social peers who are role models, and promotion of positive social relations through programs such as cooperative learning and the Good Behavior Game. These are two programs that have clear evidence of increasing the positive social interaction. The cooperative learning program has been shown to be helpful in reducing the degree to which minority kids feel like they are being disrespected or not, making friends with other kids. And so cooperative learning is, again, a program where kids work together cooperatively, and the group produces a product, and everybody's got to contribute to that product. That has reduced the degree to which minority kids feel alienated. At the same time, it prevents substance use and antisocial behavior. And if you send me an email, I could give you more information about that. The other thing we need to work on is the pro-social networking. Social media have become extremely important, and this is an area where we haven't gotten as good as we might in terms of making sure that social media are working to promote pro-social behavior. Okay, so I want to mention this paper, and if you have an iPhone and you can take a picture of that QR code, it'll get you to a website where you can get the paper, and here's the link to it. And I think it's in the list of resources. This is a paper that a number of us wrote, and it's a strategic plan for strengthening America's families. And we wrote this paper, and it focuses particularly on neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage. The level of problems that we have in our communities, it's highest in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage. And so we need to focus on those. We need a comprehensive effort over the next 10 years to identify those neighborhoods and to help each of those neighborhoods adopt all of the preventive interventions that are available, including things that improve economic well-being and so on. So I actually, if you email me, I'll send you to our website, values2action.com, and you will find not only this paper, but an analysis of why we need work on neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage. So how do we promote protective factors? I would argue that it's not enough to understand protective factors. We need to promote them. And this is a slide from the 2009 report from the National Academy of Medicine that I mentioned earlier. And this shows developmental phases on the top. And every one of these bracketed items refers to one or more programs that have been shown in randomized trials to have a benefit in terms of preventing problems, multiple problems, and virtually every one of them has a positive return on investment. And I just remembered that I was going to stop at slide 18, and I didn't. So if Laura, if you want to break in, let me finish this slide and we'll stop and have a chance for questions and conversations. But just, here are the things that are available to you if you want to reduce substance use and related problems. And I do want to emphasize, because I've worked a lot with people on substance use prevention, I want to emphasize that there's a tendency to say, well, this program has a label that it's about preventing substance use, so I'll adopt that program. Well, the problem is that if you ignore all the other things that have benefit in reducing substance use, we're not going to have as big a problem and an impact as we might. But so we have pregnancy prevention, we have prenatal and home visiting, like the nurse-family partnership. We have early childhood interventions. We have parenting skills training programs. We have social and behavioral skills training in schools and classroom-based curricula to prevent substance abuse, aggressive behavior, or risky sexual behavior. We have programs to prevent depression. There are even programs that can prevent the development of schizophrenia. And there are prevention programs that are focused on specific family adversities like bereavement, divorce, parental psychopathology, parental substance use, and parental incarceration. And those programs have significant benefit. There are also community-wide interventions, and we should not forget policy. Policy can have an impact where you don't actually have to reach the family, but you have a policy. I just testified this morning on the value of a policy that increased the price of alcohol and its benefits in terms of preventing adolescents from binge drinking, and it has actually been shown to prevent the development of alcoholism. So policies have tremendous value, and so we might talk more about that. But I'm going to stop here and see if we got questions or. And here,
Dr. Biglan.
Yes.
Thank you. I noticed that you have 3 slides. The reason we have not interjected is because all of your slides were so well connected and you were on a roll. We were all engaged. Patty and I were both engaged and just enjoying listening to you. So I'm going to give you the option here. We've got 3 questions. We can hold those to the end if you want to continue on to finish your slides.
Okay. Yes, and I want to come back to this theme of interrelated and not just substance abuse prevention programs, but thank you. I'll go on. So I want to talk about a public health perspective. Any aspect of human well-being can be examined in terms of its impact on the incidence and prevalence of that aspect in a population. So, for example, the whole world is anxiously watching the COVID-19 infections, the incidence of new infections, and the prevalence of the problem. But we've reduced cigarette smoking in this country, and one of the first things we did was we just started measuring the degree to which kids are starting to smoke, the incidence of starting to smoke, and the prevalence of smoking. And we've reduced the prevalence of smoking. But what was so important to reducing the prevalence of smoking was simply keeping track of what proportion of the population is smoking. It was about 50% of men 50 years ago. If I were doing this talk live, I'd say, if I were doing this talk 40 years ago, the room would have been full of cigarette smoke and I would have been one of the people smoking. But we have massively changed that. But the first way you do that is you keep track of the incidence and prevalence in the population. It's not enough to simply provide good services to people who already have problems. Prevention is about preventing them from happening in the first place, and we need to have a public health perspective in terms of reducing the incidence and prevalence of problems. You could also look at positive things. You could look at the incidence and prevalence of kindness in a community, or the prevalence of economic well-being, or the degree to which the community is reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that this perspective is relevant from the level of a neighborhood to the level of a state, the nation, or the entire world. We need a chart on the wall in every community that's a chart of all the positive developments of children. And it needs to, every year we need to be saying, are the good things going up and the bad things going down? If they're not, let's change what we do. And so I think this is extremely important for where we're going with these things. So from a public health perspective, we're concerned with the incidence and prevalence of substance use and substance use disorders. But, and I've said this before, if we want to reduce the incidence and prevalence of disorders, we need to increase the prevalence of all of the protective factors that nurture well-being and prevent not only substance use, but most of the common and costly psychological and behavioral problems. And so I just got one final thought. You are the key to building the society that nurtures everyone's well-being. You're not just going to prevent substance use. What you're going to do, flip over to the positive side of this. You're trying to build nurturing families and communities, and you can do that. And all of the things that are, in my book and, that I've talked about here and that you're going to get in these other webinars that are being created are the building blocks for a nurturing society where every child arrives at adulthood with the skills, interests, values, and health habits they need to lead a productive life in caring relationships with other people. I'm 76 years old, and I've kept going because this has just gotten interesting. We got all these things that work. Gee, can we get them out there? But you guys, I'm pretty sure I'm the oldest person on this call, but many of you are just starting out or are midway in this. You can do this. And so I salute you, and I am happy to answer questions or talk. And you can reach me at tony@ori.org, and you can go to values2action.com and see what we're up to there, because we are trying to help people set up these action circles to get this stuff out there and to make a difference. And on that note, I will be quiet, and we'll see if people want to talk about any of this.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Biglin. And I just advanced to the final slide so that everyone has your contact information. We've got a few questions that have come in, a lot of thank yous. So I want you to know that your presentation was very much appreciated, and I think got all of us really thinking about how we can contribute to advancing what you have just presented so very eloquently. We had one, I'm going to start from the end and then back it up to some of the comments from the beginning. The first question that came in was around the graph that demonstrated all of those evidence-based interventions on a timeline, right, across the lifespan. You mentioned a paper of those 16 interventions. Can you share that again? Is it in the resource supplement? Can we confirm that?
It isn't, but if you'll, why don't you make a list of what I need to do in a follow-up to this, and one of it will be, this is a Leslie paper, Leslie, and I will make that available.
Okay, so we'll make sure that we just...
Yeah, I didn't send you links to those papers. If you want them, I have links to most of them.
I think that'd be valuable. So if you could send us links, what we'll do is we'll update the resource supplement with those links.
Good.
And send that out as well to all of the participants on today's webinar.
Happy to do it.
Thank you. The next question that's coming in was about special populations. So how can we help those who may not have a proper support system because of fear of acceptance, specifically youth who's LGBTQ and they may not have come out yet? Is there a way to assist those with developing that support system?
Well, if I were in a community and wanted to make sure that that was being done, what would I do? I think the first thing I would do is find out what already exists in the community that would be supports for an individual, and see what they are. I wouldn't only focus on, there are probably, you would hope in most communities, healthcare providers and therapists who could be helpful to kids on that question. But I would also want to make sure that the schools were promoting pro-social relations among kids. And, here again, I wouldn't necessarily want to focus on that specific problem as much as make sure that, we have a school where we work in groups a lot, and we work and we respect each other. And those cooperative learning efforts are an opportunity to teach those things and to have kids be in positive contact with other kids, no matter what they are, no matter what they're like, no matter what they're concerned about. So, if I were trying to deal with this in a community, I'd want to know what services are currently available and what the quality of those services are. If there are not effective services, then I'd want to go to experts, nationally, to help find out what those are. And actually, what we need, if we're creating an action circle on this, the first thing we do is we try and get the evidence on what are good practices and where are those practices being implemented. We'd make a database of the organizations that are working on it, and then we would help local action circles come up with a plan for how they could get those services and practices implemented in their community. I don't know if that's clear or not, and maybe you want to ask further questions about it.
That is clear. Thank you. And if they do have further questions, please go ahead and submit that in the Q&A box, and we will present it to Dr. Biglan. We also had another question coming in about your website. So your website information, we will definitely make sure to include in the resource supplement if it is not already there when we send it out again. But did you want to just mention it again very quickly right now?
Yeah, it's valuestoaction.com.
Okay, valuestoaction.com. And Patty, maybe we can go ahead and submit that to everybody so they have that in writing as well through the chat box. Okay, we did have two questions come in about ACEs. The first one I'm going to read aloud. Most, if not all, of the 10 original ACEs are associated with unsupportive and harmful parenting. This suggests that the most important takeaway from the ACE study, and the one that is not being addressed, is that many ACEs can be prevented with public health approach parenting education. Perhaps national parenting education campaigns akin to the smoking and seatbelt campaigns of the past. Perhaps a national multimedia messaging that teaches parenting behaviors and practices generally recognized as supporting the healthy development of children. Do you agree or disagree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, if we had more time, the parenting stuff started out with clinicians working with an individual family with an aggressive kid was one of the first ones that there was a lot of work on. And so much of this is sort of clinical interventions with individual families. But then some people started to think about this in terms of public health. And one of them was Matt Sanders, who's in Australia. And he created the Triple P program, the Positive Parenting Program. And he has, and again, he was setting out to try to provide parents with as much or as little as they needed to solve problems. And so Triple P is now in use worldwide. There have been numerous studies showing its efficacy. One of them was done by a colleague of Denny Fishbein's and me, Ron Prinz, and he did it in South Carolina. They had 18 counties, and 9 of them got Triple P, and the other 9 didn't. And this was for parents of young children. Well, the way Triple P works is they try to provide you with often as little help as you need. So you don't have to come for 10 sessions. And so one of the things they did is they developed tip sheets. There are about 40 of them for common problems you might have with a child. Wetting the bed, not going to sleep, tantruming in a supermarket, getting along with a sibling. And so they have tip sheets. And so in South Carolina, they trained people would be in frequent contact with parents, such as early childhood care providers. And so they trained them to use these tip sheets. So it wasn't just a matter of handing out tip sheets, but if a parent complained that they were having trouble with their kid tantruming, the early childhood person might give them a tip sheet and say, here are the things. Now, I want you to give this a try. Oh, and how did that go? So there's a little follow-up. They found that they significantly reduced hospital-reported child abuse in the 9 counties that were doing Triple P. So here's a public health approach which is as efficient as you can get. Now they've got it online, and a colleague of mine has done a study where they, just use this online version to help parents. So we're making a lot of progress, and these are the things we need to do more of.
Thank you, Dr. Biglan. There's a question around epigenetics and brain plasticity in relation to your biological mediator column on that beautiful slide you had earlier on. I know that Dr. Fishbein addressed a lot of this in her presentation 2 weeks ago, and I just wanted to make the viewers aware that all of our technical webinars are available on our ADAPT YouTube channel. Patty will be sending out the link to that. You'll be getting that as participants today, but it is hosted. It's here within the resource supplement. At the very beginning, you'll have information on ADAPT, and there are ways to connect with us via social media, as well as how to join our email distribution list. And it has the YouTube channel link there. So I wanted to address that. Another question came out about the slides, and all of the slides are included in the resource supplement that you're able to download right now. as a PDF. So the question around brain plasticity is this. He is wondering if you have any suggestions on articles that maybe they could reference in the future about epigenetics. And they'd love to hear your thoughts on brain plasticity and how you think about it as a biological mediator, if you consider that a viable biological mediator.
I'm not able to see the people who are on this call, but somewhere in there, I believe, is Denny Fishbein. So you put me on the spot with this one. She knows far more about this than I do. Actually, one of the things that I think is important is, you remember I said that you have your babies early. The process that started is an epigenetic process. The genes are expressed that drive the child in the direction of immediate reinforcement. Get what you can get when you can get it. And so the reason that those genes are expressed is that humans have evolved a tendency to be able to deal with threatening environments by this fast life strategy. So I think that would be an example of brain plasticity, and where Denny and I have, I wish I could see her face, where Denny and I are sort of, how can I say it? There's been a tendency for people to think that it's the brain that causes behavior. And so what we need to do is understand the brain and change the brain. The National Institute of Drug Abuse has been working on vaccines to prevent people from using substances. So far as I know, they haven't made much progress on that. But it's the environments that cause the brain to be this way. And if you don't change those environments, the brain is not going to do the things that it needs. And Denny and I will have pleasant arguments about this. I wish you could, give the mic to her. So I'll just shut up about epigenetics.
Okay, and again, I'll refer this participant and everyone else to the webinar that is on our ADAPT YouTube channel, where she did discuss this in greater detail.
Oh, and I will mention this, the paper by Greg Miller where I showed that diagram was published in Psych Bulletin, and if you remind me, I'll make that available. But he actually, I'll mention one other thing about it. He's teamed up with Velma Murray and Brady. They developed the African American Strengthening Families program that they tested in Georgia. And what they found was that when they helped, they had 9-year-old black boys in rural Georgia, and they did a randomized trial. And the ones who got this program, it taught parents to be less harsh and more supportive and so on. And they had changes in physiological measures of stress 9 years later after this program had been provided. So there's clear evidence of the physiological benefit of nurturing environments.
Thank you, Dr. Biglin. And you are in luck. Dr. Fishbein did just submit a response through the Q&A, and this is her response. The brain does not develop in a vacuum. Social determinants of health are critical to determining how the brain will develop and function. So that is her response and her piggyback on what you have just said.
Thank you, Denny.
Okay. We had a question come in about this recording, and you all should know that you'll be receiving an email once this is uploaded in the next 24 to 48 hours. And once it's available on our YouTube channel, you all will get a link to that so that you can share it and view it again. We have many that view the technical webinars over and over again. All right, the next question, shifting gears completely. What are your thoughts on outdoor advertisements for alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, and vaping products? Billboards and other types of advertising that are seen by youth. To what degree do these advertisements normalize use of these products? Do you have data that shows youth seeing these ads are more likely to use substances?
I was a court-certified expert in U.S. versus Philip Morris et al. I am actually a federally certified expert on the marketing of tobacco to young people. And yes, there's no question about it that the marketing of these products has an influence on young people, and it is a harmful influence. And I could go on and on about it. The evidence is there for alcohol as well as tobacco. There isn't as much evidence on vape, but the basic, the way you get kids to use these things is you associate the product with social acceptance. You'll be popular with friends. I learned to, in a certain way, love the Marlboro commercials because they were so beautifully done. And what they did was they communicated that if you smoke this little stick of tobacco, that you'll have more friends, that you'll be popular, that you will there'll be more excitement in your life, and so on. And so you associate the things that young people desire with the product, and it sells the product. And so, yes, there needs to be more control on marketing than there is currently. I was an expert witness for Australia when they adopted the plain packaging. They call it plain packaging, but actually it was disgusting packaging. Hold on a second. Can you see this? Can you see
Yes.
that? Okay. This is the package that one of the packages that they used in Australia. And if you try and buy cigarettes in Australia, you would go into a store and they're behind a cabinet. You can't see the brand. And when you get the cigarettes, they look like this. And it has significantly reduced smoking in Australia. The United States has made a lot of progress in tobacco control, but the courts have ruled that it is a violation of the free speech rights of the tobacco industry to force them to have packages like this. And so we don't have packages like this that demonstrably reduce the use of these products. So yes, marketing is a huge influence. There are no longer billboards for tobacco allowed, but it's still an issue. And we published a paper on that recently. So enough on that, because I could go on for hours about this topic.
I have a feeling that we're gonna get a question about that paper you just mentioned.
Okay.
Will you also send us a link to that so we can include it in the resource supplement?
If you put it on my list.
Yes,
I assume you're going to send me a to-do list, so.
We sure will. Okay, the next question is around policies and how government agencies maybe can work together. How can government agencies best work together to meet the many developmental needs you've just described? Some needs seem to fall under a health department wheelhouse, while preventionists and other departments specialize in improving data around other risk and protective factors at a local level. Do you have any guidance on that?
Repeat the last part of that question.
Do you have any guidance related to, so the macro level question is, how can government agencies work together to address this, to put SHMs in place and infrastructure in place to meet the multiple demanding needs? And then underneath that, they were describing that some needs seem to fall under the wheelhouse of health departments, right? Mm-hmm. And then others, like preventionists and other departments, right, are specializing in data and working towards risk and protective factors at a local level. So this is a question around government.
Actually, Denny and I are working with others on trying to articulate what the federal government and what state governments could do to make progress on these problems. And what one of the things we're calling for is at the federal level is an interagency process that would ensure that every federal agency that's relevant to preventing any one of these multiple problems would work together. Because as the person asking that question is clearly implying, if you don't have that, then you got some people working on this problem and other people working on that problem, and you're not having all that coordinated. The people who have data and are using data, that's our chart on the wall for how we're doing. We need the data on the well-being of children and adolescents in every community. But then you need the healthcare system to invest more in prevention, but you also need the criminal justice system to be changing their methods so that they're investing in prevention and supporting prevention, and so that they're using rehabilitative programs rather than punitive programs, so that we have a recidivism rate that's off scale compared to European countries that do a much better job. So you need every sector of society really needs to be focused on the well-being of the population. Just think about the marketing of cigarettes or alcohol. We can measure the proportion of people who have problems with those substances, and we need everybody working on the well-being. We need the practices of every sector of society to be evaluated in terms of the degree to which they are increasing the incidence and prevalence of problems versus decreasing them. So it's not just the marketing of tobacco, alcohol, guns, and so on. It's also how well are you paying your employees? Because if you have your employees working for having to work two jobs, you're undermining the well-being of families. So we need the business community to be concerned about it. We need higher education to be investing more in prevention and training the people to engage in prevention. We need the healthcare system to be measuring how it is doing in terms of the incidence and prevalence of problems, not simply waiting until people are ill and treating them. 95% of the healthcare dollar is spent on treating problems that could have been prevented, which is why you guys are the key to the future of all of this. I do have another book that called Rebooting Capitalism, which if you go on my website, you'll learn about it. But that talks about how we need to reform every sector of society.
Mm-hmm. And I think we all can see your two books right behind you.
Yes, and that's because there's some website that is vetting everybody's background, right? They say, you're constantly seeing people's bedrooms or background and so on. And so one of the things they concluded was that having your books up was tacky. So here's my tacky book promotion. But the other one is very popular is pineapples, but I don't have a pineapple. I apologize.
Okay, so we had an interesting question come in, and actually we get this a lot from some of our HIDA communities because funds are limited. Funds are limited. And the question is around, is it essential, right? You've spoken about impact and the synthesis of programming to create greater impact, right? Is it essential for prevention programs to address both risk factors and protective factors in that full spectrum prevention net that they try to create? Or is it more beneficial to focus very strongly just on protective factors?
Well, that's a tricky question. Certainly we need to focus on risk factors as well as protective factors. But most of these programs, take the family interventions. We know that the risk factors are things like harsh and inconsistent discipline, failure in monitoring, neglect, and so on. But if you want to change those reduce those risk factors, you need to reinforce and teach pro-social, positive ways of parenting. Every one of those parenting programs basically helps parents replace inconsistent and ineffectual or harsh ways of parenting with the positive ways of parenting. So it's most of the protective factors are, you're building those up as an alternative. And in fact, if there's one basic principle that I think we don't pay enough attention to, it's the reinforcement of alternative behavior. You take the PACS good behavior game. What it does, people ask, well, is it trauma informed? Well, yes, it is. But you don't address the problems of a traumatized child by focusing on how they're traumatized. You create an environment that's safe and protective and richly reinforces their behavior and the behavior of other kids, in relation to them. And so we're just trying to build that kind of nurture. So it's not an either or, it's mostly a replacement. How can we build on these things? But, humans have evolved in a circumstance where if you're doing something aversive to me and I say, stop doing that, and you stop, I immediately get reinforced, right? It takes a little more to get me to get good at ignoring what you did and thanking you when you do what, I wanted you to do. And so, it takes some skill to get people to be reinforcing. I'm not sure if I'm being clear about that, so I'll shut up.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to reframe this next question that just came in a little bit. The question was around at what phase can we intervene so that adverse childhood events may not have the same traumatic impact over the course of a lifespan. And I think throughout the course of your presentation, you've made it clear, right, that really intervening as early as possible and developing and generating and investing in these protective factors, right, is critical. But I'm going to reframe it just a little bit and ask, if that doesn't happen, right, within the elementary school age, birth, beyond, right, within elementary school, even within high school, if they're not getting that at home and they're not being exposed to that in those coercive environments that you described earlier on, is there another opportunity? Is there another opportunity to intervene and change their trajectory?
Sure. The acceptance and commitment therapy movement in clinical psychology has shown that it helps people to let go of the stress, the anger, the fear that's driving them. I've been in workshops where full of psychiatrists and psychologists and so on, and you ask them, think about something you don't like about yourself and just kind of put it in your hand and just hold your hand up when you've thought that thing. And then when you ask people, okay, if that's only been a problem for the last year, put your hand down. 5 years, hand down. 10 years, hand down. Most people keep their hands up. These are things that they brought out of their childhood. And the number of people who feel like they're wrong, they're bad, they're no good is just astounding. And so what an ACT therapist does is help people to notice those thoughts and feelings and to step back from them and notice that they're there, but to get clear about what they want their lives to be about. And I've seen people just change dramatically. Let go of the stress that they've been carrying. Notice that they have these negative thoughts about themselves, but move in the direction of what they value. I've seen people forgive a parent that they've always, been angry about. That parent had ruined their lives and so on and so forth. And it turns out that if you forgive that parent, you can go forward. And so, there's a lot to be done in the mindfulness movement and the acceptance and commitment therapy movement, and that's chapter 5 of the Nurture Effect. And there's plenty of other books, but I don't want my assignment of things to get you too long. So,
thank you. And I'm also going to take this opportunity to put a plug in for the resilience campaign that we just concluded. Resilience is a concept that really can be built. It can be learned, it can be grown and developed over time. We have many ways of doing this. There are many evidence-based practices for this. And what we've done through ADAPT is we took the American Psychological Association's 10 ways of enhancing resilience. We translated that into very concrete activities for individuals to do. And that's something you can use at any point in life. Our whole ADAPT team engaged in some of those activities as well to build our and enhance our own resilience.
Please send me that information.
You bet. It is all on our ADAPT website, which is on the first couple pages there, information on ADAPT. And Tony, you'll get a special email with a link to our ADAPT website.
Good.
I just wanted to, we've got two more questions here. I want to make one more comment that Denny, we've got 2 minutes left. Denny, Dr. Diana Fishbein did add one more statement. She said in the context, and this is related to epigenetics, guys, in the context of a threatening environment, genetic proclivities are expressed that can manifest as maladaptive behavior. That's an epigenetic process. So spoken by Dr. Diana Fishbein, and again, catch her webinar on our ADAPT YouTube channel from 2 weeks ago. The question that comes in that we can end on, and then we'll pass it over to Patty, Dr. Biglin, is how do you relate the reforms in the various sectors of societies that you were mentioning a little earlier? How do you relate that to the study circles in small communities?
Well, what we've done is we've sort of articulated the ways in which different sectors of the society are failing to ensure the well-being of the entire population, and the marketing of cigarettes and alcohol and unhealthful food are examples of that. So business, the reforms in business are a matter of every business organization keeping track of how well it is ensuring the well-being not only of its investors, but its employees, its customers, and the community as a whole. And business is shifting in that direction. So that's what needs to happen in business. But you can have an action circle that can identify businesses in a particular community and ask them if they have pledged to make all 4 of those outcomes things that they're trying to accomplish. So you can start to do that. With respect to climate change, you can have an action circle that gets on the ballot a measure to adopt a policy that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. With respect to criminal justice, you could have an action circle that identifies policies that have proven benefit in reducing coercive interactions between police and people living in high poverty communities. With respect to education, you can have an action circle that helps teachers develop their skills in teaching, through explicit instruction, teaching kids how to read. That action circle could also set up a system to make sure that we are measuring what proportion of the kids in 3rd grade can read competently at 3rd grade level, which is a vital point. You could also have that action circle set up supplemental instruction so that after school settings and churches could provide additional training. And you could also distribute a book like How to Teach Your Children to Read in 100 Easy Lessons, which has 1 million copies have been sold. And then I taught my sons to read with it. My wife is a direct instruction teacher, and my son, that you remember that infant you saw, he also learned using the same book. So I'm talking too much, and that's some of the things that we are working on at Values to Action.
Dr. Biglin, I think I speak for everyone when I offer you a sincere thank you for the presentation today. It's extremely informative. The Q&A just lit up with questions about it, and we were able to get to most of those questions. We apologize for just a handful that maybe we're not able to get to. And I'm going to hand it over to Patty, but I would be remiss if I didn't say we've had the Q&A now light up around the resilience campaign and questions about resilience. So I've asked Patty to put our website as well as our email just directly in the chat if she's able to do that for all of you to copy paste. It is in the resource supplement. You will be getting it as an attendee, when we send out the follow-up email with a link to the recording for today. Thank you again,
Well,
Dr. Biglin.
Let me say this, that you guys, I talked about the audience, but you guys, your organization is doing wonderful work, and I am very pleased to have been invited to do this. So thank you, and thanks, Danny.
Hello, everyone. I just put in the chat the link to our website, and you'll see here on the slides our email address. So hopefully you have all of the contact information for us. We will also be sending out to everybody after today a revised resource supplement with additional links. Many of those are already included in the slides in the reference list. And so what we'll do is we'll get you a more active link for how you can access those after today. So again, thank you, Dr. Biglin, and for everyone else for attending. I just want to let everybody know that we have made a few changes to our upcoming schedules. So our next fundamental webinar will be on Thursday, May 6th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time on persuasive messaging and substance use prevention. A registration announcement for that will be forthcoming in the next week. So lastly, you will notice that whenever the webinar ends or you click that small X in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll receive a post-presentation survey where you can complete and then automatically be emailed a certificate of completion and 1.5 continuing education credits for your participation in today's training. So on behalf of the ADAPT team and our presenter, we want to thank you for joining us today and wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.